Wanted to walk through statutes, state agencies, and the Administrative Procedure Act. California's Administrative Procedure Act, known by its acronym the APA, basically provides the statutory rules and procedures that all executive branch agencies and departments and boards and commissions and other such entities are required to follow when engaged in quasi-legislative or rulemaking activities, i.e. when they're adopting regulations. And in some instances, the legislature exempts these executive branch agencies and departments from the APA process by statute. In other cases, the legislature deems there to be an emergency for a particular agency or department to adopt an emergency regulation. And then in other instances, the legislature grants authority to the agency to utilize other actions that do not have to follow the APA. So I wanted to look at some of the language that is used in California statutes for these purposes. So the first one is complying with the APA. And I'll read you an example of when the legislature specifically requires an agency or department to comply with the statutory provisions of the Administrative Procedure Act, which is found in California's government code. So it might look like, or here, the department shall adopt, amend, or repeal in accordance with Chapter 3.5, commencing with Section 11340 of Part 1 of Division 3 of Title 2 of the Government Code, and Chapter 4, commencing with Section 18935 of Part 2.5 of Division 13, any reasonable rules and regulations as may be necessary or proper to carry out the purposes and intent of this chapter. The following, I'll read an example of when the legislature is allowing or intends to allow an agency or department to utilize means that would otherwise qualify as a regulation and therefore need to abide by the APA, but they don't under these circumstances. So it might read something like, notwithstanding the rulemaking provisions of the Administrative Procedure Act, Chapter 3.5 of Part 1 of Division 3 of Title 2 of the Government Code, the State Department of Social Services may implement, interpret, or make specific this section by means of all county letters or similar written instructions from the department. I'm also going to give you two examples of what you might see for exemptions from the APA. These two examples are when the legislature specifically exempted an agency or department from having to comply with the statutory provisions of the APA. The first one is the Franchise Tax Board may prescribe rules, guidelines, procedures, or other guidance to carry out the purposes of this section. Chapter 3.5 of the Government Code shall not apply to any rule, guideline, or procedure prescribed by the Franchise Tax Board pursuant to this section. Another example of an exemption from the APA by statute is the following. The board shall adopt rules for the conduct of its affairs. The rules shall be exempt from Chapter 3.5 of Part 1 of Division 3 of Title 2 of the Government Code. As I mentioned, there are also instances where something is deemed an emergency under the APA. So I'll read you an example of when the legislature deems an emergency to exist by statute. And as a result, the agency or the department doesn't need to find or to make a finding that an emergency actually exists. And so that agency or department gets to proceed with an emergency rulemaking project. It might read like, the adoption of any regulations pursuant to subparagraph A may be adopted as emergency regulations in accordance with the rulemaking provisions of the Administrative Procedure Act and shall be deemed an emergency and necessary for the immediate preservation of the public health and safety or general welfare. They might go further and even say, notwithstanding Section 3.5 of Part 1 of Division 3 of Title 2 of California's Government Code, that these emergency regulations shall not be subject to the review and approval of the Office of Administrative Law. When I was researching this, looking at statutes in the APA, I came across an interesting example, which I'll read to you, which is when the legislature is very specific about what it wants regulated, but still providing some discretion to the agency or department in order to determine how to achieve the regulatory scheme as envisioned by the legislature. So this was the one I came across. A wave basin shall be subject to regulation as a permanent amusement ride under the Permanent Amusement Ride Safety Inspection Program in the Labor Code. And the Division of Occupational Safety and Health may inspect and otherwise oversee the operation of a wave basin to ensure compliance with those standards and requirements. This section does not limit the existing authority of the division to regulate permanent amusement rides. It went on to say, the department shall adopt regulations regulating sanitation and safety of wave basins. The regulations adopted pursuant to this section may be modeled upon the sanitation and safety regulations for swimming pools, but shall be modified to reflect the unique characteristics of a wave basin, including the volume of water, chemical dispersion caused by wave action, and the site of a typical wave basin. Pretty unique. Anyways, in the examples I've read to you today, the legislature is affecting the impact of California's APA on different state agencies and departments. So not only does the legislature grant a portion of its lawmaking power to the executive branch through statutes, but also the legislature specifies the rules that may or may not have to be followed by these agencies and departments. And these examples basically impact the APA and its rulemaking activities review by the OAL and how the rulemaking activities are going to be conducted by the state's executive branch agencies and departments in California.